I am an artist in midlife. It amazes me to think that 30 years ago, I was only 25 and just beginning adulthood after graduating from art school. I can't begin to imagine 30 years from now when I'll be 85 and looking squarely at my life's end. For the past few years, my work has evolved into a mixed media layering process. I work this way because mixing and layering feels like a true reflection of how my life has unfolded. For me, studio practice has been the place where many threads of personal and collective experience interweave. In telling this brief story, I hope to share both sides of a helix. My personal journey is deeply embedded in a larger tale of cultural context, as most stories are. I grew up in a house filled with imagery and the energy of image makers. My mother collected objects crafted by hand from all over the world. The silent presence of color, texture, and form created an indelible layer throughout my childhood. Sadly, my mother and her mother before her, as women raised in earlier times, were both deeply frustrated artists. My mother had been a gifted painter in her teens. Her mother had been a passionate dancer. Both women were not allowed to follow their hearts. My mother was denied art school by her blue-collar stepfather, and her mother's creative spirit was dashed by a repressive, born-again Christian older sister who raised her following the early death of their mother. I feel particularly blessed to have been a teen in the 1960s. I see those tumultuous years as a time when the Western world, but especially the United States, was gripped by a desperate need to rebalance our cultural psyche. Those years saw the birth of ecology, of feminism, of Black pride, of Chicano unity, and on and on. From my perspective, we were a culture so dominated by masculine principles left over from the world wars and the Industrial Revolution that the spirit of the feminine had simply been denied or forgotten. Somewhere in my young and emerging heart, I knew I needed to be far away from the conflicted and unhappy reality of my own mother's life. Being my father's good girl was important to me in my teens. Rather than running away, I applied to go abroad as an exchange student and thus hatched my escape. The year I spent so far away from home created the next indelible layer of my creative evolution. Living in Belgium, I enrolled in my first drawing class. My mother, unrequited artistically, had never supported or encouraged any of her children to explore the visual arts. It felt like her domain somehow. It was as if she jealously guarded the threshold of the art temple. While in Europe, I visited some of the world's greatest works. I saw the David, the Pietà, the Sistine Chapel, the Parthenon, Venice, Florence, and Paris. My experience in the presence of these master works was to feel called to respond. It was this trip at the age of 17 that set me firmly on the path as art student. But my story can't go further without acknowledging another critically important thread. At the age of 15, I experienced date rape. Just 3 months shy of my 16th birthday, my world and sense of self was turned around in a most dramatic way. I share this news here not for shock value, but to set the stage for another layer of my story as a woman artist. 6 months after the devastating experience, I stumbled on a book by Indira Devi about the practice of Hatha Yoga. I hadn't told anyone about the rape, but I was in deep need of healing from the experience. I gravitated towards alternative nutrition and Hatha Yoga. It was the late 60s after all, and alternatives were blossoming everywhere. I mentioned this layer of my life because for me, learning the tools and skills of an art student was so profoundly interwoven with the practice of Hatha Yoga. My body became a vehicle for devotion, prayer, healing, and refining my perception. In essence, the years of daily yoga practice brought me to creative spirit. I painted, I stretched. I drew, I breathed deeply. Studio practice and yoga practice became my twin scaffolds for healing from an unhappy home and a violated body. But again, I need to take another sidestep in the story. Having left home so young and after such an extended stay far away, I returned to the States and felt profound culture shock. I didn't fit anymore. My friends and family couldn't relate to my experiences abroad or who I had become. I dutifully went off to a small experimental college across the country, but looking back, it was no surprise that within a year, at age 19, I left the States once again. This time I ended up in central Mexico, where my unconscious search for healing on many levels played out for decades. My story could go on for hours if I were to digress and sing praises of how life in Mexico healed so many layers for me. Most simply, I'll say this. In Mexico, I found loving, healthy surrogate mothers. I learned to love, to paint, and the intricacies of printmaking in the Spanish language. I stretched, breathed, meditated, and continued the long, slow process of re-inhabiting my body. As for the helix of intertwining threads of one's personal life and cultural collective, looking back, I see that where I experienced pain in my home due to repressed creative spirit, culturally, that same feminine spirit or right lobe reality, or however you choose to name it, is denied and degraded on too many levels to even count, still today. Where I have focused many years of attention on healing from an assault on my body, we as a culture have the enormous parallel task of addressing environmental assault on the body of our earth. And not least, of course, as a woman, I feel privileged to witness the reemergence of renewed honor and respect for the unique perspectives and gifts of the feminine principle, nationally and globally. We still have such a long way to go. It's Thanksgiving Day today, and I give thanks for the crucible that art making has been for me all these many long years. Jungian psychologist James Hillman said, "Imagery is the language of the psyche," over 25 long years ago. In response to his words, I say, gracias a la vida, thanks be to life.